12-year-old girl expelled from camp for defying orders, but her grandma's phone call stunned everyone. I didn't know drawing trees could get me kicked out of a summer camp, Ava mumbled, wiping charcoal from her fingertips onto her shorts. But I guess when you're black and loud with your pencils, that's considered a threat. Camp Everwood was supposed to be the best 2 weeks of her summer. Tucked between pine-covered hills in upstate New York, it boasted paddleboarding, archery, arts and crafts, and something they called leadership workshops. Her mother had worked 2 extra shifts a week at the diner to afford it. For once, she had said, cupping Ava's chin, I want you to be the girl who gets invited to the campfire, not the one who sets it up. Ava had arrived full of cautious hope, sketchbook in hand, and her grandmother's silver locket around her neck. On day 1, she'd already been warned twice, once for refusing to sing the camp's founding song that mentioned the brave sons of our land, and once for asking if she could draw instead of play dodgeball. It wasn't that she hated the camp. She just didn't feel like shrinking herself to fit it. But the breaking point came on Thursday. The sun hung low and golden, casting long shadows on the field where the Team Unity Challenge was being held. Ava had been assigned to Team Blue. Their task, build a truss tower out of wooden crates. The idea was to stack them as high as possible, one person standing on top while the others handed up crates. When it came time for Ava to climb, she hesitated. Y'all didn't check these crates for spiders, she said, only half joking. She was ignored. The other campers had started chanting her name in a way that felt less encouraging and more like a dare. I'm not climbing, she finally said. It's not safe. The counselor, Mr. Brett, tall and tan with wraparound sunglasses and an eternal whistle around his neck, stepped forward. Ava, we talked about this. Leadership means pushing past fear. No, Ava said simply, her eyes never leaving the crates. Leadership means knowing when something's dumb and saying no. The air shifted. He walked up to her, lowering his voice. Are you refusing to participate again? I guess I am. And just like that, she was sent to the camp director's office, told to sit on the log bench outside with her duffel bag while the staff called her parents. They didn't even let her grab her sketchbook from the art cabin. Another counselor dropped it on her lap on the way out, like she was returning a library book. Her charcoal drawings were crumpled. She wasn't angry. Not really. She was used to being too much. Too curious. Too opinionated. Too quick to point out when something was unfair. In school, she was told she was disruptive. At birthday parties, she was a little intense. Here, she was defiant. She didn't know what was worse, being called that, or the way the other girls looked at her after, like she'd farted in church. But none of it explained why her grandma called 37 minutes later and why everything changed after that. The camp director, Ms. Campbell, was sitting behind her wide pine desk, sipping from a mug that said Camp Hair, Don't Care. She wore a pastel polo and a forced smile. Her tone was light, but her words cut like gravel. We're concerned about Ava's ability to integrate into a group setting, she'd said to the speakerphone, arms folded. The voice that answered was unmistakable, calm, slow, deep. Ava's grandma didn't yell when she was angry. She slowed down. Ms. Campbell, are you aware my granddaughter was awarded a regional art scholarship last month? There was a pause. I know I wasn't. Are you aware she was invited to speak at the school board for implementing more inclusive curriculums? Another pause. No, Then maybe you're not the best person to judge her leadership qualities. Ava had sat up straight. Let me be real clear, her grandma said. Miss Campbell opened her mouth, but said nothing. I'm coming to get her, the voice said, smooth as thunder. And we will be having a conversation with your board. I suggest you have your notes in order. Click. Ava had never felt so tall in her life. What happened next spread through the camp like wildfire. Some whispered, others stared. Her cabin mate, Melanie, came to hug her before she left and quietly slipped a crumpled note into her hoodie pocket. It read, I'm sorry. I should have said something. You're brave. By the time her grandmother pulled up in the old Lincoln, Ava had already made a decision. In the passenger seat, she didn't cry, not even when her grandma reached across to squeeze her hand and whispered, You didn't do anything wrong. Ava stared at the passing trees, her fingers tracing the cover of her sketchbook. Can I draw what happened? Her grandmother smiled. Not only can you, baby girl, you must. The next week, Ava's drawing stark, beautiful charcoal images of camp counselors looming over children, of crates stacked dangerously high, of a single black girl standing firm while shadows curled around her went viral. Her mom posted them online under the caption, "She didn't defy orders. She challenged broken systems." Outlets picked up the story. Parents from other camps came forward. A former Everwood counselor admitted on social media that kids of color were often labeled problematic for things white kids did daily without consequence. The camp director released a lukewarm statement that backfired spectacularly. Within days, sponsors pulled funding. Investigations opened. But for Ava, the real victory wasn't in headlines or hashtags. It came 2 months later at a town library in Newark, where her work was displayed under the title Uncomfortable Silence. A crowd of over 200 filled the room, mostly families. But in the front row sat a quiet group of kids from her old camp, Melanie among them. When Ava took the mic to open the exhibit, her voice shook but never faltered. "I was told I was too loud, too bold, too much. But I wasn't too much. I was just enough to make someone uncomfortable. And that means I was doing something right." The applause rose like a wave. And when it was over, when she stepped down from the podium, Melanie ran to hug her, this time in front of everyone. Ava smiled, locket warm against her chest. She had been expelled, yes. But now the world was listening. The gallery stayed open 2 hours past closing that night. People lingered around Ava's artwork like it carried heat. Grown men wept silently in front of the drawing titled Target Practice, where a stick-thin black girl stood alone at the center of a field, crates circling her like a bullseye. Children pointed and asked questions their parents couldn't answer without their voices breaking. A local journalist wrote the next morning, "This wasn't just an exhibit, it was a confrontation." But Ava wasn't done. The morning after the opening, she woke to dozens of emails and messages. An education nonprofit wanted to feature her drawings in their national conference. A middle school teacher from Florida asked for permission to print her art for a lesson on racial bias in discipline. But the one that made Ava's breath catch came from a woman named Kendra Hartley. Subject: Let's talk. Kendra introduced herself as a civil rights attorney who had grown up in the same town as Ava's grandmother. "Your drawings shook me," she wrote. "I'd like to meet you both. I think you're onto something bigger." Bigger turned out to mean a formal complaint filed against Camp Everwood, backed by testimonies from over a dozen former campers of color. Ava sat in the living room while Kendra explained the process, how they'd gather affidavits, how they'd present evidence to the state, how even if no law was technically broken, they could pressure the board into policy changes. "But this means putting yourself out there more," Kendra said gently. "It means scrutiny. Some people will try to paint you as an angry kid. Are you ready for that?" Ava didn't even look at her grandma. Her voice came clear and steady. "I was painted as a problem before I ever picked up a pencil. I might as well tell the truth now." And she did. The process took weeks, then months. The board responded with a bland denial. Kendra, unfazed, filed for a hearing and demanded the camp release their internal incident reports from the last 5 years. What they got back was damning. Black and brown campers were 4 times more likely to be written up for noncompliance. Notes included phrases like attitude problem, too assertive, and refused to smile during group activities. One report even listed a girl's hair as a distraction. Ava read them all, jaw clenched. It wasn't just her. It had never been just her. Kendra helped organize a press conference in front of the county courthouse. Ava stood beside 3 other former campers, 2 high schoolers, and 1 college freshman. They each shared their stories. One talked about being told not to use her native Spanish at the lunch table. Another described being mocked for her urban clothes. Ava, the youngest, went last. "I was told I didn't belong," she said into the mic, "but I see now they were afraid I did." The clip aired that night on local news, then national, then viral again. But for all the attention, Ava's life didn't go back to normal. At school, teachers were more cautious with her, overly polite, like she might write them up. Some classmates avoided her. Others latched on too hard, calling her brave, like it was a magic spell that excused their silence. Worse were the letters. Anonymous notes shoved into her locker. Messages like, "Why do you hate white people?" and "You ruined camp for everyone." She started sleeping less, drawing more. Her grandmother noticed. "You don't have to carry this whole thing alone," she said one night, settling beside Ava on the porch. "You started the fire. Baby, but fires don't keep going without others throwing logs. Ava didn't answer at first. She was sketching again, this time a wide field, burned down to stumps, and a small girl planting something new in the middle. I'm not tired of fighting, she said finally. I'm just tired of being alone while I do. That's when the letters started coming, real ones this time. Ava's P.O. box filled up with handwritten notes from kids in Wisconsin, Texas, Alabama. Some had drawn their own pictures. Others just said thank you. One stood out, from a girl named Camila, who wrote, "They said I was loud too. But now I know it means I have something to say." Ava smiled. Then one morning, her grandmother held up the phone and said, "You might want to sit down." It was a voicemail from the Department of Youth Programs. "Miss Carter, we've reviewed the materials submitted in your civil rights complaint. Based on the evidence, we're initiating a state-level audit of Camp Everwood's policies. Additionally, we'd like to speak with Ava about helping shape our new diversity and inclusion standards for summer programming statewide." Ava blinked. They want me to help them? Rewrite camp rules. Her grandma chuckled. That's what happens when you turn your truth into power, baby. The meeting was held 2 weeks later at a conference center in Albany. Ava wore a navy blue dress and brought her sketchbook like armor. The room was full of adults, most in suits, most white, most smiling too hard. But Ava didn't shrink. She presented a list titled, "If I Could Rebuild Camp." It included things like let kids opt out of activities without punishment, train staff in racial bias, and celebrate all cultures, not just with food days. At the end, she added one more line, written in bolder letters, "Hire counselors that look like us." There was a pause, then nods, then applause. By spring, changes were underway. Camp Everwood was placed under probation and forced to retrain staff. New pilot camps were developed based on Ava's recommendations. She was invited to speak at panels, roundtables, even a TED Youth event. But the most surprising moment came in June, exactly 1 year since she'd been expelled. A letter arrived. It was from Melanie. Not an email. A letter. Neat handwriting. 2 pages long. She wrote about how she'd spent the last year thinking about that day, the crates, the silence, the way she'd watched Ava walk away and hadn't moved. "I thought I was being neutral," Melanie wrote. "But now I know silence is a choice. And I chose wrong." She apologized, not with excuses, but with humility. "I want you to know I didn't forget you," she ended. "And I'm trying to be braver now." Ava read the letter twice, then sat for an hour before reaching for her pencil. She drew 2 girls standing under pine trees, one handing the other a crate not to stack, but to sit on. That summer, Ava didn't return to Everwood. She helped design a new camp instead, Camp Echo, a place where every kid's voice was meant to bounce back louder. And on the first day, as she watched the buses pull in, Ava stood beneath the flagpole with a clipboard, a lanyard, and her grandmother's locket resting proudly on her chest. When a young boy stepped off the bus, eyes wide and nervous, she smiled and bent down. "Hi," she said gently. "What do you love to do?" He blinked. "I like making paper animals." "Well, we've got a whole tent just for that. Come on, I'll show you." The wind rustled the trees. Somewhere, kids were laughing. And for the first time in a long time, Ava felt like she wasn't fighting a system anymore. She was building a new one. One sketch, one voice, one brave kid at a time. Camp Echo wasn't just a name. It was a promise. It sat on reclaimed land near the Hudson Valley, surrounded by tall trees and even taller dreams. The cabins were simple, the meals home-cooked, and the rules handwritten on a giant chalkboard at the entrance, not posted, but voted on by the campers themselves. Ava, now 13, had insisted on that. If they don't help shape it, she told the board when pitching the idea, they'll never believe it belongs to them. By midsummer, Camp Echo had 65 campers from across the state: Black, brown, Asian, neurodivergent, queer, kids in wheelchairs, kids who had never set foot outside a city block. Every counselor was trained in trauma-informed care, and one cabin was staffed entirely by former campers like Ava who had experienced discrimination firsthand. But even in this new world Ava helped build, she learned quickly, fairness didn't erase struggle. Justice didn't mean ease. There were tears, fights, a boy who refused to sleep indoors, a girl who flinched at every loud noise. And then there was Zion. He arrived halfway through the second session, 11 years old, foster system, mostly silent. He carried a single duffel bag and never looked up. Ava saw herself in him. At first, he didn't engage. During group circle, he stared at the dirt. When asked to draw a self-portrait, he handed back a blank page. But Ava didn't push. She just sat next to him every day at lunch, sketching trees, until one afternoon, he tapped her arm and pointed. "You're doing the shadows wrong," he whispered. Ava blinked. "Oh." He nodded, serious. "That tree's leaning east. You need the shadow here." She handed him the charcoal. He hesitated, then took it. They drew together for 20 minutes. The next day, he asked if she'd seen the creek. By the end of the week, Zion was teaching other kids how to fold origami frogs and had started designing a comic book about a black superhero who controlled wind. His smile, when it came, was small but radiant. On the final night, during reflections by firelight, each camper was invited to share something they'd learned. Some read poems. Others cried. But when Zion stood, holding a folded scrap of paper, the entire circle went still. "I used to think I wasn't good," he said, his voice shaking. "Not just at stuff, just not a good person." A quiet ripple passed through the group. "But Miss Ava said I didn't have to be loud to be strong. And I think maybe I'm strong now." He sat down. A few kids clapped. One counselor wept quietly. Ava stared into the fire, her heart too full for words. The next morning, Zion gave her his comic 10 pages, folded carefully, the last page a sketch of a caped hero with braids standing on a rooftop, her hand outstretched toward a younger boy rising into the sky. Ava cried in the car after the buses left. But her work wasn't done. Over the fall, she and Kendra pushed for broader reform. Their team met with lawmakers, camp networks, school boards. Ava's story was no longer just about Everwood. It was about how easily institutions labeled young black kids as difficult, defiant, or dangerous instead of creative, curious, or courageous. She was invited to speak at a panel for national youth policy in Washington, D.C. At 13, her grandmother bought her a navy blazer and pressed her locket before she left. "Just tell your truth, baby," she said. "They won't know what hit him." The room was packed. Reporters, nonprofit leaders, education officials, even 2 senators. Ava stood at the podium, hands steady, heart pounding. She began not with numbers, but with a story. "I was 12 when I got kicked out of a summer camp for refusing to climb a stack of unsafe crates. They said I was defiant. But what I was right." The crowd sat silent. "I've learned since then that kids like me get labeled fast. Not because we're bad, but because we're black and bold and make people uncomfortable. And instead of fixing the system, they try to shrink us." She took a breath. "But I don't shrink anymore. I lead." Her words were quoted on news shows, printed in op-eds, even recited by other kids at school walkouts demanding more mental health resources. But behind the scenes, not everyone was clapping. Camp Everwood's lawyers had filed a countersuit, claiming Ava's drawings caused reputational harm and emotional distress to the staff. They accused her of exaggerating events and creating a hostile public climate. It was brutal. Online trolls surfaced. Fake accounts spread false claims. One night, someone spray-painted liar across the fence outside her grandma's house. Ava curled up in bed, her hands trembling, unsure if she could keep going. Her grandmother sat beside her, stroking her hair. "You know what they're really afraid of?" she said softly. "That people are finally listening to you." "But I'm just a kid," Ava whispered. "No, baby. You're a storm in sneakers." The next morning, Ava recorded a video response. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just held up one of her original sketches, the one of the crates, the empty field, and said, "This is my truth. It's not always comfortable, but it's real, and I won't erase myself to make you feel better." It was viewed over 5 million times in 3 days. And Everwood's lawsuit? Dropped quietly a month later after public backlash mounted and multiple former staff members testified in Ava's defense. But by then, Ava had already turned her focus elsewhere. She began working with a coalition of youth leaders across the country, helping create a toolkit for safe, inclusive summer spaces. The guide, called Camp for All, included activity ideas, counselor training tips, and a checklist titled, "Is your program safe for every voice?" Ava's name was on the front cover. Requests poured in. Schools, youth centers, even churches began using the toolkit. And then came the invitation Ava never expected. The governor's office asked her to join a new Youth Equity Council, a group of 10 kids, ages 12 to 17, tasked with advising state departments on policy. Ava stared at the letter in shock. Are they serious? She asked her grandma. They'd better be, her grandma grinned. You're already doing the job. At the council's first meeting, Ava walked into the chamber with her locket, her sketchbook, and a purpose bigger than herself. She was no longer just the girl who got expelled. She was a builder, an advocate, a changemaker. But she still remembered the roots. Late one night, after a long meeting, she returned to Camp Echo for the fall weekend retreat. The cabins were quiet. Leaves blanketed the ground. She walked to the fire pit where, over a year ago, Zion had stood trembling in the dark and claimed his strength. And she began to draw again. Not pain this time, but possibility. 2 kids running through tall grass. A cabin with an open door and a sign that read, "You belong." A girl standing beneath pine trees, not alone, but surrounded by others who once thought their voices were too small, too strange, or too loud. Not anymore. And as the stars emerged overhead, Ava smiled softly to herself. This time, she wasn't just telling her story. She was making space for others to tell theirs. That winter, Ava returned to her middle school not as an outcast, but as a name everyone knew. Some students still avoided her. Others looked at her like she was something extraordinary. But a few approached her in quiet corners of the hallway, eyes lowered, voice barely above a whisper. I think what you did was brave. My cousin got treated like that too. Do you think I could come to Camp Echo next summer? Ava always smiled and said yes. Because it wasn't about her anymore. Not fully. It was about them. The ones who still sat in classrooms afraid to raise their hands. The ones who stayed silent even when they burned to speak. Still, there were days she felt the weight again, like walking through snow that kept getting deeper. Then one day in March, her grandmother handed her an envelope. No name on the front. Just a return address from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Inside, a folded note. And a photo. The note read, "You don't know me, but my son went to Camp Everwood the same summer you did. He told me what happened. He didn't speak up then, and he's carried guilt ever since. But after seeing what you built, he applied to be a counselor at a camp here, one that takes kids from group homes. He starts in June. He says he's ready now." The photo showed a black teenage boy standing in front of a camp bus, holding a clipboard. On the back, in shaky pen, were the words, "Because of Ava." Ava pressed the photo to her chest. She didn't cry. Not this time. She just breathed in deep and smiled. Spring bloomed fast. Camp Echo opened registration in April and filled to capacity in under 3 days. They had to create a waiting list. Donations came pouring in from all over the country, families, educators, even celebrities. Ava and the team began planning expansions. By the time she turned 14, they were scouting locations for Camp Echo South and Camp Echo West. But amidst the growth, Ava kept her promise to herself. Every session, she sat down with the kids and listened. One evening, during free period, a shy boy named Jalen handed her a crumpled drawing. It was rough, thick pencil lines, jagged trees, but the figure at the center was unmistakable. A girl with a giant pencil like a sword, facing off against a mountain. He'd titled it, "Ava versus the World." "I didn't know what else to call it," he said nervously. She grinned. "I love it." Later that night, she pinned it to the inside wall of her cabin right next to her first drawing of the crates. History and the future, side by side. Then one Saturday morning in early July, something unexpected happened. Camp Echo received a formal letter, not from a sponsor or a school, but from Camp Everwood. A new director had been appointed, a woman named Dr. Elena Mireles, a former child psychologist and DI advocate. The letter was respectful and surprising. It read, "We acknowledge that mistakes were made, not just isolated incidents, but patterns that excluded and harmed children. We are working to change that culture. We would like to invite Ava Carter, as the creator of Camp Echo, to consult with our leadership team as we rebuild with accountability." Ava stared at the letter for a long time. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Vindication? Suspicion? Relief? She turned to her grandmother. "What would you do?" she asked. Her grandma studied her. "You already did what they said couldn't be done. Now you get to decide not what to tear down, but what's worth rebuilding." So Ava said yes with conditions. She met with Dr. Mireles and 2 board members via Zoom. She laid out her expectations. Transparency, real change, clear consequences. Dr. Mireles nodded. We're not asking you to fix it for us. We're asking for your help so we can fix it with you. It was the first time Ava had heard those words and believed them. By August, Everwood had released a public statement acknowledging past failures and listing concrete changes: racial bias training, an anonymous camper feedback system, inclusive hiring practices, a partnership with Camp Echo. Ava didn't accept their apology blindly, but she gave them the one thing they hadn't earned before: a chance. Because she'd learned by now, real change doesn't always roar in. Sometimes it arrives in letters, in folded drawings, in a kid brave enough to whisper "me too." At the close of summer, Camp Echo held its first reunion festival. Former campers returned, some taller, some shyer, all stronger. Zion was there, a year older and almost unrecognizable. He brought a portfolio of superhero sketches and sat on a panel about finding your voice. When he spotted Ava across the lawn, he ran up and hugged her without hesitation. "I'm writing a graphic novel," he said breathlessly. "It's called The Quiet Storm." Ava beamed. "I'd buy the first copy." He held up a worn piece of paper, the same comic she'd received the year before. "It started with you." There were bonfires that night, songs, laughter, a sky full of stars so bright they looked unreal. Ava sat near the edge of the fire circle, watching kids toast marshmallows and dance barefoot on the grass. Her grandmother stood nearby, leaning on a cane now, but smiling wide. "You did it," she whispered. Ava shook her head. "We did." The next day, Ava returned home and sat down at her desk. She opened her sketchbook, flipped to a blank page, and began a new drawing. Not of the crates, not of battle, but of a bridge. Wide, strong, lit with lanterns. And across the bridge, kids of all kinds, walking side by side, notebooks in hand, stories on their backs. Above the bridge, she wrote a single sentence: "When they shut one door, build the whole house." That image would later be printed on the cover of Youth and Justice Quarterly, hung in classrooms, and posted in counseling centers across the country. But Ava didn't draw it for recognition. She drew it for the kid out there, right now, who was being told they were too loud, too angry, too much. She wanted them to know they weren't too much. They were enough. And their story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The end. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.